Hi, everybody. Welcome to Not KNITLIB, the podcast today. My name's Susan, for those that don't know me, and I have decided to do a little thing to kind of keep myself occupied and hopefully yourselves occupied during this very odd time of self-isolation, physical distancing, and in some cases, complete lockdown quarantine. I've been home away from everybody since about March 9th, and just a little bit of background. Yeah, I've been home since March 9th, and it's like now what? I don't know what the date is today. It's now whatever date. Time is irrelevant now. It's the 23rd, March the 23rd, yeah. So I've been home for a long time right now. And that's because I have been dealing with a prolonged viral infection. That's what my doctor has said that it is. I've basically been sick persistently, consistently, stubbornly ill since December. And if you follow some of my vlogs from Christmas time and some of my recent podcasts, you know how sick I've been. I'm not really going to go into the whole details of what that sickness ended up being, but I'm on the mend. And right before COVID-19 kind of really hit the place where I live, which is in Alberta, Canada, I had already been put on bed rest and self-isolation. So, yeah. I've been home. I'm going a little cabin fevery. You probably are too. And I thought, with that thought, there's so many people that are having to stay home, having to homeschool their kids, or if they have kids at home, or maybe you're living alone, or you don't have family around you, and the isolation can be pretty tough. And I thought it would be a fun thing to do a sort of quarantine read-aloud thing. There have been lots of videos for read-alouds for kids, and there haven't really been anything for grown-ups. And I don't know about you, but I love having books read aloud to me. I always have. I love listening to audiobooks. But even more than that, I think that doing a video like this, what I'm hoping to do once a day, will keep you connected, feeling like you're connected, that you have somebody in your space, even if it's virtually. Let me come into your space and hang out with you for a little bit and read you a chapter from one of my favorite books. I started doing it on Instagram, but Instagram was being a little stupid and not allowing me to upload long videos, so moved it over to Instagram. What is this? YouTube. And I'm going to be uploading these videos with very little editing, and just to keep it real and conversational. And I'm going to try to be uploading a video every day if I can, and just to keep you company, and hopefully you can keep me company too. The book that I'm going to be reading is one of my favorite books that I had when it was given to me by my friend Samantha, who is a science fiction and fantasy writer living here in Canada, and she has her first novel coming out next year, I believe it is. It's very exciting. But anyway, she's really good at finding unusual, strange books, and back when we were in our 20s, she found this book in a secondhand store here in Calgary and thought, oh, to quote her, oh, Dory, that's a word, that's a Susan word, that's a Newfoundland word. So this book here is called, let me see if I can get it to focus here. It's called Don't Have Your Baby in the Dory, and it's a biography of Myra Bennett, written by H. Gordon Green. It's published by Harvest House, and it was published in 1973. about that. Let me get this to focus again on me so I don't blow out. Great. And this book is one of the original publications. This one was printed, I think, in 1974. And yeah, this book, I loved it. When she gave it to me, it was a bit of a joke. Then I ended up reading it when I was in art school, and it became such an inspiration for me. Myra Bennett is a nurse, was a nurse, in rural, very, very rural Newfoundland, in Northwestern Newfoundland. She was the only medical professional for about 200 miles of coastline where she lived. And this would have been, she arrived in Newfoundland in around 1921, and then this biography was written in the 70s, and she was still alive at that point. She was in her 80s at that point. She's a remarkable woman, and this book, while there are parts of it that are very dated, it is a remarkable glimpse at life in Newfoundland during the turn of the 20th century, early 20th century, and the resiliency of communities and of people, and the sense of humor that Newfoundlanders, speaking as a Newfoundlander, always seem to possess during times of stress and all that stuff. So, because this is an older book, yeah, I don't think you're going to be able to find this anywhere to purchase. I really don't. If you're really that into it, I think it's a hard one to find. So that's why I'm going to read it to you. And yeah, I am not sponsored by anybody. I am not taking any money for any of this. I do encourage you, if you love this book, to, once our local libraries open again, contact your local librarians and see if they have this book available. So yeah, there are 14 chapters in this book. I'm going to read the introduction and chapter 1, or the introduction and chapter 2 to you today, and then tomorrow we'll read chapter 3. Yeah, so settle in, get yourself something nice to drink or something. I have water in a mason jar. Get your knitting, your crochet, your needlework, your busy work, whatever that busy work is. Get that with you. We're going to do some reading. I'm going to read to you, and yeah, let's take a moment, shall we? Chapter 1, The Man Who Never Complained. One October morning last year, a rugged old liviere, as permanent inhabitants of Newfoundland are called, stood with me on a hill in northwestern Newfoundland, looking down at the coastal village of Daniels Harbor. To me, it was bleak, an uncomfortable morning. The sun had no reach to it, and the wind, which rode in on ship-high waves from Labrador, tore at the shingles of the frame houses clinging to the rock ledges below us. Overhead, the gulls screamed as they kept trying to climb above that wind, and a few yards away, a sled dog pulled his tether to the choking point to get into the lee of a fish shed. In the stony bit of field beyond the cemetery, some girls were skipping rope with their mitts on. Skeletons of stunted juniper caught at our feet, and the few half-green junipers which tried to grow out of the bones of the dead ones were already tortured by the storms into the shapes of a sick dream. To a shivering mainlander like myself, there were but 3 elements in this part of the world: wind, sea, and rock. And each of these seemed diabolically determined that man had no business here. But my friend evidently saw a different country than I did. Beautiful morning, sir, don't you think? There is an inexplicable something about Newfoundland which makes one hesitate to be dishonest, even for the sake of being polite, so I parried the question, was there anything at all in the scene which was gentle or fat? I wondered. And I recalled the supposedly funny story of how, according to the See, like, I will get tied up a little bit in my words. No editing, just saying. And okay, let's see. Was there anything at all in the scene which was gentle or fat, I wondered, and I recalled the supposedly funny story of how, according to the worldly wise of the mainland, the Newfie plants potatoes. He puts the seed on a rock, lays a herring over it to keep it from blowing away, and then scrapes up a bucket of earth to throw over it. It occurred to me now, as I looked below me at the gardens were remarkably verdant, and I said as much. Beats me how you can make a garden grow on this coast. My friend laughed with the ease of a man to whom humor is as necessary to survival as potatoes and fish. If a man has enough elbow grease, he can grow just about anything here, he said. A man doesn't need to be hungry very often around here if he's willing to work. I picked up a stick of the dead juniper and ran my fingers over the gnarl and twist of it and wondered what strange strength kept the men of this rugged shore so straight and proud, and what kept them laughing so freely. My friend seemed to read my mind. Lived here all my life at Daniels Harbor, sir, and I couldn't have asked the good Lord for anything better. Not that I deserved it or anything, but it's a very, very full life and awful exciting, sir. When I came away from Daniels Harbor a short time later to begin the writing of this book, I was still thinking of that remark, for the man who had showed me the harbor that morning was Angus Bennett, seaman, fisherman, carpenter, storekeeper, guide, bake-apple dealer, and most important of all, the husband of Myra Bennett, the amazing woman who for 50 years had been nurse to some 200 miles of this coast. And during that half-century, Angus has had to interrupt his work time and time again to rush his wife by boat or horse or dog team to some nearly inaccessible cove where death tapped impatiently on someone's door. Or, if there were others to take his wife where she alone could help, he has had to resign himself to being alone for weeks at a time, or keeping a house for their 3 children and whatever convalescing patients Myra might have left behind in their parlor. He has given his own bed to more emergency cases than he can easily recall. He has seen dozens of babies born on his own kitchen table. He has held many a shrieking child between his solid knees while his wife opened a boil or rooted out a throbbing tooth. And he has cleaned more messes from his kitchen floor than you can ever get him to talk about. For nearly half a century, Angus Bennett has been privy to nearly every pain, every tragedy on this coast, but he still insists that it has been a marvelous life. I have been wonderful lucky that I could help a woman like that, he says. Myra Bennett's lonely battle with death and disease has not gone unnoticed. Premiers and prime ministers, bishops and archbishops, doctors, social workers, and journalists have all tried to give her the honor they know she deserves. Most cherished of all of these honors is her Medal of the British Empire, given to her by George VI. But to me, at least, that brief statement by the one person who has known her best and the longest is surely the finest tribute of all. It is indeed something more than the tribute of a great husband to a great woman. It is proof as simple as it is sure that when one finds happiness in helping, such things as money and comfort and geography are very trifling matters. Knowing Angus as I do now, I am certain that he will be more than happy for this book to leave him in the background and center its attention on the life story of his incredible wife. But this biography could neither be fair nor complete, I think, without some special acknowledgement for the man whose love and patience and quiet strength have supported her through all of her magnificent years of struggle. Allow me then to dedicate this book to him. I do not have to ask Myra to know that she will approve. Isn't that nice? I love that. Chapter 2. of Zeppelins and War Babies. Now in chapter 2, I will preface this in saying that this one will introduce, this is when we get to know Myra and get to know her upbringing a little bit, but also her time living in England when she was just becoming a nurse. So this was a really long time ago. Think World War I. Okay, so we're going way back in time. Yes. Let's go on to chapter 2. To a future generation, there will be few aspects of our present way of life quite so mystifying as our reasons for heaping fame on a woman. And surely, if our grandchildren have the intelligence to survive the chaos we will have left them, they will be particularly caustic of our custom of lavishing wealth and worship on one of the opposite sex because of the pretty face, or a super bosom, or a voice with some kind of squeak or quiver in it. Nor will they be able to understand why we have given so little recognition to many of our truly magnificent women, to those whose courage and sacrifice and inspiration have made this world, or some part of it, a better place to live in. And in that more sensible day, it is entirely possible that Newfoundland's Nurse Bennett will have become the kind of heroine which the school books love to make into a legend. Those who think that prophecy is somewhat unlikely might consider that most of the heroines who are already established in the readers and history texts are there because of the way they met a single emergency. But Myra Bennett, in her 50 years on the Northwest coast, has faced so many emergencies that she hasn't had time to record them all. It should also be remembered that few of the duly acknowledged heroines were without some human help or advice in their hour of trial. But in most emergencies which confronted Myra Bennett, she was desperately alone, and death himself was often the challenger. This is awfully dramatic, isn't it? We need a little bit of a drink. At the age of 14, Myra Grimsley was an attractive, bustling tailor in a London shop, and something of her ability to adapt herself may be indicated by the fact that by the time she left the job to train as a nurse, she had learned to speak her employer's Yiddish. Shop hours were long in those pre-union days, the work exacting and the pay was pitifully meager. Nevertheless, the energetic young miss was somehow able to save enough to complete the course for a diploma in nursing. Myra can never remember a time when she aspired to be anything but a nurse. Her first nursing job of any importance was in 1911 in the Surrey town of Woking. Is it Woking? I think it's Woking. Then a railway junction between Portsmouth and London. Apart from the activity in the railway yards, Woking was a rather quiet, peaceful place with no more hurry in it than there was lush surrounding countryside. And it was here that Myra became district nurse, a post which required her to carry her skill into the homes much as a nurse of the Royal Victorian Order might still do today. She traveled on foot or by bicycle, a quietly ambitious young woman whose bustling impatience must have seemed rather out of place in surroundings which were so unhurried and haphazard. Then, in August of 1914, Britain found herself in the throes of a terrible war, and Myra Grimsley found that her chosen profession was one of the most desperately needed skills in the whole empire. As for the town of Woking, its idyllic country existence ended almost overnight. An ammunition works was hastily established there along with other factories which were needed now to appease the dreadful appetites of war. The railway junction itself now became one of the most important ones in the nation, and through its yards men passed by the thousands on their way to France, many of them never to return. A little later, When the war began to take to the air for the first time in history, an airplane factory was established here, and along with it a testing area. The none too steady roar of the very first warbirds now became a familiar sound in the Surrey skies. To the sensitive young nurse, the most immediate concern was the tremendous number of refugees which soon began to flood in from London, and the terribly few doctors who came with them. Doctors were even more importance to the realm now than nurses were, since the war across the Channel was swallowing far more of them than could be spared. There was another aspect of the war with Germany's Kaiser, which was threatening the health of the nation, and that was the severe shortage of food. Britain, always dependent upon its colonies for its bread and meat, was now surrounded by another insidious danger, the submarine pack. The insularity, which had so often been its salvation in the past, had now become an enemy which might starve it to death. But for the young nurse on her bicycle, there was still another new horror to contend with. January of 1915 saw the first Zeppelin raids on the coast of England, and within a matter of weeks, the giant silvery gas bags from Germany began to drop their deadly cargo inland. And Myra had to risk the treachery of England's first blackouts to carry on her mission of mercy. Walking, with its strategic railway junction, was a prime target for enemy bombs. She recalls with a chuckle now that on one blacked out night when she was on her way to attend a maternity case, her effort to comply with the new regulations was to paste tissue paper over her bicycle headlight and focus the beam downward. She got only as far as the railway overpass in walking when an authoritative voice came out of the dark ahead of her, commanding her to stop. We need a drink. Stop is a word which has never frightened Myra very easily. I wondered what silly fool should be trying to interfere with my going to some poor woman in labor, she says now. The thought also crossed her mind that perhaps here was a soldier who wanted to use the dark for a bit of clandestine romance. That's code for something much worse than that. In any case, Myra's bicycle kept pointing its way towards the house up the hill, where a baby was in need of a little help to get through this crazy world. Stop, came the command again. Myra, who even then had a healthy contempt for officious authority, replied by pedaling faster. I love Myra. The third time the order sailed out of the black at her, Myra got off her bicycle. I was thoroughly angry, she explains. I was all set to give some smart young fellow a real dressing down for trying to play games with me when I was in such a terrible hurry. But to her utter astonishment, a shiny bayonet suddenly cut through the feeble beam of her bicycle light and pointed straight at her breast. And when she came to her senses, Myra could see that a roadblock had been thrown up directly ahead of her. Sorry, miss, the soldier said, but we've got our reasons for thinking there might be some saboteurs around tonight. Pretty important place, that railway bridge, you know. And what identification might you be carrying? Nurse Grimsley didn't have to produce much in way of credentials, however, as a couple of other guards quickly came up to vouch for her reliability. She's our nurse hereabouts, they told the officer, and she's all right. It must have been comforting for the young nurse to realize that even in the hollow dark of night like this, she had been able to find friends. The Zeppelin raids reached their peak of terror the following autumn, when they became brave enough to go further and further inland, even dropping their cargo of death on London. Myra left walking the next year and went to the maternity hospital in Woolwich, but the Zeppelins found her there too. Woolwich happened to be the site of an arsenal, and the Germans knew it. Strangely enough, we didn't depend too much on the sirens to warn us of a coming raid, Myra remembers now. The dogs seemed to be much more reliable. Whether their ears could detect a sound of those airship motors so far away, or whether it was some other sense man doesn't understand, we all knew that the dogs would often set up their howling quite some time before the sirens would go off, and that extra time was very handy for us who had to evacuate a hospital. Some of the preparations for those early air raids seem rather peculiar now. First of all, large bowls of chemical solution were placed at convenient spots in the corridors, and beside each of these was a large pile of cotton pads. One of the great fears of those months was that the Zeppelins would drop gas bombs as well as explosives, and one of these pads, soaked first in the solution, could be tied over the nose to make a fairly effective mask. Having prepared as best they could for a cloud of the fearful chlorine, the nurses and their aides would take their patients down into the cellar, placing them on mattresses along with their babies. The nurses themselves, however, were not allowed to stay below where they were in comparative safety. Always there would be some patients on the floor above who were too sick to be moved, and it was the duty of the nurses to return to these unfortunates and stay behind them during the bombing. Can you imagine? Ugh. We had to stay once, and we had a fire alarm at the library. And you have to, if there are people with mobility issues, you have to go into one of the fire staircases until the fire alarm stops, or that the fire department can come and rescue you. And you're just sitting there in like this concrete stairwell, hearing the alarm just go off over and over and over again. It does not do much for instilling a sense of calm, I'll tell you that. Especially if you're there trying to calm a patron. It's not fun. Okay. Yes, Myra admits. There was some hysteria at times. It wasn't very pleasant for those mothers to be locked up in that basement while their other children were miles away, perhaps, and maybe having to shift for themselves. Myra recalls ruefully that their iron-nerved matron had a very effective way of forestalling any outbreak of emotion on the part of either patient or staff. She promised faithfully that if any one of us lost our head or fainted during a raid, she would pour a bowlful of that horrid anti-gas solution over her head afterwards. Pretty mean. The threat was generally sufficient. Myra also recalls that a sort of tradition grew up around those Zeppelin raids. Always there would be some sort of picnic lunch afterwards in the basement. If no bombs had fallen near them, bread and butter sandwiches and tea were deemed sufficient. If a bomb or two had shaken them up, however, hammed sandwiches were the order of the day. It got so that we almost wanted the bombs to come, Myra remembers, because ham sandwiches got to be a wonderful treat in those days. It was during the early months of the war that Myra decided that she would like to be something more than an overworked nurse with no particular specialty. The conviction began to grow on me, she says, that I would make a good midwife. I was strong, I didn't fluster easily, and there was something about the task of alleviating the pain of labor which attracted me. There are people, you know, who are rather happier when they can move into the eye of a hurricane. I suppose I was always one of them. As a nurse doing general work, Myra had been given considerable experience in maternity work right from the start of her career. Midwives were quite common in England then, and in those days, when few women went to hospital to be delivered, it was often the rule, rather than the exception, for the midwife to be the stork's only attendant. The English midwife was well qualified and governed by strict regulations. In Myra's early nursing days, there was a law which required a nurse or a midwife to summon a doctor immediately if a birth presented any deviation from the norm. Ordinarily, this law would have been strictly observed. But in 1914, when the doctors were needed behind the trenches and in the military hospitals, it became increasingly hard to find a doctor when one was needed. And generally, when one could be found, he was old and overworked, and so nearly exhausted that the nurse could get very little help from him. Many and many a time, Myra remembers, I would deliver the child while the doctor stole a wink of sleep stretched out in the corner chair. And as time in the war went on and doctors became harder to get, I found myself forced to cope with all sorts of malpresentations and abnormalities without any real professional help. So it was out of these this is a word I don't know. Exigencies? It's like, let me see it. Yeah, it's this word. I don't know that word. That's a hard word for me. So, back on track. So out of the exigencies of war, a marvelously skilled midwife was born. Bleh. Myra insists, however, that for all of her experience, she still had much more to learn about maternity work, and the idea grew in her until June of 1915. She began a special course in maternity work in Woolwich. It was a course which lasted 6 months in the hospital itself, and Myra followed this with 3 months of actual casework in the slums of North London. That 3 months among the poor and forgotten of a war-torn city was not an easy one. Indeed, from the very start, it looked as though that the fates were contriving against her. I'm getting a little Greek around here. The very first baby I delivered, after completing my course, died 10 minutes after it was born, she recalls. It was an awful ordeal for me, really. Not that it was in any way my fault. I'm sure that it wasn't. The mother had lost 2 babies before, but as long as I live, I shall never forget how painful it was to have to go back to the matron and report that the first case she had assigned me had ended in tragedy. Perhaps tragedy is hardly the word for the loss of a child, newborn to the conditions in which Myra worked those days, for the North London slums of the war years were like something out of a Dickens novel. Here the demoralization of war was at its worst. Prostitution, illegitimacy, and drunkenness were common everywhere. Myra remembers that on more than one occasion when she prepared some humble tenement room for delivery, she would first hang an apron over the window to keep the curious street urchins from watching the proceedings. She remembers, too, that sometimes the patient who was in labor would have so much gin in her system that the baby, too, would be under the influence of alcohol when it came into the world. It made you wonder, when you had a bit of a quiet afterwards, Myra says, made you wonder how we can really believe that all men are born equal. For nearly 3 years, Myra worked tirelessly in North London. It would be a mistake to say that she was entirely happy with her mission, however, because she could never feel what she was doing could really change the appalling conditions she saw on all sides of her. Could there be any depth of satisfaction in ushering a babe into a world where the cards were stacked against him from the very first cry? For Myra Bennett, as she was later to be known, has never been the kind of person to hold her peace when she sees something which is in dire need of change. Even today, as a woman well over 80, she is an aggressive and outspoken person. Had she not elected nursing as a career, she most certainly would have been a social worker or a reformer of some sort. The other reason why Myra's days in the London slums were something less than happy was because of the discipline which went with the job. The matron was an officious, overbearing sort who seemed to be convinced that under no conditions must one of her nurses be given any praise. Nothing I could do for her was ever right, Myra says. And Myra's greatest trial was yet to come. In the fall of 1918, a disease called Spanish influenza suddenly struck such terror in the Western world that it seemed as though the Almighty might have been devising a way of his own to end the war. The first cases were comparatively mild, like a mild attack of measles without the rash, according to one medical history. The second wave of the epidemic could not be taken so lightly, however, and the doctors seemed powerless to relieve a patient struck down with it or to contain its contagion. And toward the end of the year, when the third wave of the epidemic had all of Europe and America in its grasp, the fatalities it left behind were more numerous than those suffered on the battlefields. Worst of all, the disease seemed to strike hardest at young adults. In October of 1918, after working night and day among those who had been brought down with the epidemic, Myra herself got the flu. Always blessed with an exceptionally rugged constitution, she managed to withstand the attack, and in a few weeks she was again astride her bicycle with her little black bag, answering more calls than ever. She will admit now, of course, that she made the mistake so commonly made by flu sufferers in those days, and these days today too. Often the mistake was fatal, of getting out of bed too soon. But with Myra, the mistake was especially serious because no sooner was she out of bed than she was working more hours per day than ever. Not only that, but she was doing so without adequate food. Those last days of the war were dolefully hungry ones for Britain. Something of her weariness at that time is expressed best perhaps by a page from her own journal, where she writes, "In the early years of November 11th, the telephone summoned me in the early hours of November 11th. The telephone summoned me for a case, and I dragged myself out of bed outside for a 4-mile journey to the patient. To say ride would not be correct. I could free wheel downhill and coast along a road that was flat, but I had to dismount and lean on the handlebars and push whenever there was a bit of a hill to climb. It was a slow process, but I was too weak to do anything else. Eventually I reached the house. Because of various abnormal conditions, the patient had been required to book the services of a doctor. Since all the young doctors had already been absorbed by the services, there were only 2 elderly men left in the district, and one of those arrived shortly after I did. He had a car with a gasoline ration, but he was too weary to be much help. He said, "I will give the anesthetic, you apply the forceps." The case concluded satisfactorily, and after a short rest, he left me to do the necessary postnatal care and attention. My work being finished, I too left the house, returning as I had come, leaning on the handlebars for support when I had to go up a grade and freewheeling whenever there was a slope in my favor. Feebly, I was making my way home, thinking that the minute I got there, I would go back to bed for a rest. Then I suddenly noticed that people seemed to be pouring out of the shops, many of them carrying bunting. One lady was walking her bulldog, and its leash was a small string of flags. My first thought was, some people don't seem to be suffering much from the war, or the flu, or bereavement. I had suffered all of these now. Pushing my bicycle a few more weary steps, I met a lad whose mother had recently been a patient of mine. He was hopping and skipping and laughing, and when he saw me, he yelled, "Isn't it wonderful, nurse? The war is over!" It took some moments for the news to sink in. So the war was finally over. My mind spun. A brother of mine was in a grave in Gallipoli. Another was Gallipoli. Another was somewhere in the Pacific en route, I hoped. to his first leave. 2 others were in hospital with war wounds. All for what? What had been accomplished by this war? Suddenly I sat down on the curbstone and wept. Myra decided to take life a little easier now that the war was over. Surely she wouldn't be so badly needed now, with the doctors coming back from France along with the nurses who had gone across the channel with them. Moreover, the gradual easing of the flu epidemic and the availability of decent food again was allowing the nation as a whole to return to its normal good health. So Myra was in the receptive mood when she was one day offered the position of a resident nurse in a quiet London home for unmarried mothers. The home was one of the less publicized costs of war. If, as someone has caustically observed, the first casualty of war is truth, then conventional morality must surely be a casualty number 2. Soldiers of many armies had passed through England on their way to the trenches, and many of these returned to England from the battlefield. Some came back on leave, some to convalesce from wounds, some to wait for the overloaded ships that would take them back to the land of their birth. These men spoke different tongues, were of different races and religions, were of different social backgrounds, but they all had one thing in common. They were lonely and without women. It should be remembered, too, that in wartime the attitude of our women also undergoes a dramatic change. Even for a girl whose upbringing has been the strictest, giving herself to a man who might very well be dying for her tomorrow is almost the patriotic thing to do. Sorry, I kind of choked a bit on that. Hence the unprecedented number of natural children born throughout the world. And with the soldiers flooding back to England in such a carelessly jubilant mood after the victory, it isn't strange that the rate of illegitimacy should have risen even higher. The full extent of the tragedy is something that can never be known. But the England which but a few years ago clung so comfortably to Victorian Puritanism now became a nation where broken homes and unwanted children were common on every side. The role assigned to Myra was to be midwife and nurse in an institution which was dedicated to the rescue of some of these unmarried war mothers. It wasn't a large hospital and rarely had 4 girls in a bed at one time. In a bed. I said that before too. Rarely had 4 girls been in bed at one time. Not 4 girls in a bed at one time. This is not Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. But it was also provided a refuge for girls who were waiting their turn at the delivery table. And one of these girls was always assigned to Myra to act as her helper. Aside from the companionship of the girls themselves, the home had a woman in residence who acted as a sort of chaplain or spiritual advisor. And it was in this woman that Myra found a friend whose influence was to change the whole course of her life. Myra was scarcely fitted into her new surroundings before she became restless. The work was not particularly hard, nor was it more poorly paid. Most of all, Myra appreciated the relief from discipline which to her had been utterly ridiculous. But the plain fact of the matter was that Myra became impatient with inactivity. Who else is like that? Who else is feeling that right now? Oh my God. There simply wasn't enough to do in a place like this. And one evening when she had confessed as much, her friend the chaplain asked her, "Have you ever thought about nursing someplace other than in Britain? The Overseas Nursing Association needs help badly." The suggestion began to take root, and Myra began reading everything she could about nursing in other parts of the world, particularly in those places that needs seemed to be the greatest. And one night while browsing through Nursing World, a 2-penny weekly, which practically every nurse in the realm read in those days, she came across an article which was to haunt her for many days afterward. The story came from Saskatchewan and told the case of a woman who was married to a homesteader somewhere in the north of that province. It was a wild day in March when the woman felt her first labor pains, and though the weather was very bad for traveling, the frightened young husband set out with a horse and sleigh to fetch the doctor, who lived in the nearest town about 10 miles away. The doctor was busy elsewhere when the poor man arrived, however, and by the time he was ready to accompany the homesteader back again, the weather was worse than ever for traveling. A spring rain mixed with snow had softened the roads so completely that the horse sank at every step, and that the trip that normally took a couple of hours seemed now endless. Finally, the men came to a creek, which the rains had made absolutely impassable, and it was some time the following morning before they were able to reach their destination. They were too late. Alone and in horrible agony, the young wife had died trying to give birth. There was something about this simple story of stark tragedy that wouldn't let me sleep at nights, Myra will tell you. It is difficult to express the feelings it aroused in me, but to think of that poor woman dying out there on the rim of the prairie for nothing but the want of a little help was almost more than I could bear. It was something I couldn't forget. And that is why, when Myra Grimsley at last made the decision to write the Overseas Nursing Association and offer herself for service abroad, she asked to be sent to Saskatchewan. The association was immediately interested in Myra's request, but it still had a few more questions to ask her. "Can you bake bread?" it asked. To which Myra, though quite mystified as to what the relationship there might be between homemade bread and nursing, replied quickly that she could soon learn. What the association had in mind was simply the need for the kind of woman who could not only look after herself completely, but one who would be as versatile as humanly possible. And the admissions committee was quick to realize that Myra Grimsley was exactly that kind of nurse they needed most, even if she couldn't as of yet bake bread. She learned soon after, and she had baked her own bread ever since. She was 29 years old now, in excellent health, could sew like the professional she had once been, played the piano well, was modestly artistic, her father was still an interior decorator in London, and she had a wonderful ability to command respect without being in any way officious. She had seen too much officiousness in women in those days when she had had to endure the matron of Woolwich, and she had been determined ever since not to let the same trait make her frighten people too. The Overseas Nursing Association was pleased with what it found in Myra and accepted her gladly, and it promised it would do its best to send her to Saskatchewan. That is the first time I've ever heard anybody say that. That they'll do their best to send you to Saskatchewan. Joke. The world was still clogged with the confusion of war, however, even though it was now nearly 2 years since the armistice had been signed. Troops were still waiting for ships to take them back to America, and while tens of thousands of those who had come over were now lying in France and Belgium, many of the others had found European wives to take home with them. Indeed, many a soldier had a family now. Furthermore, many of the biggest and best ships that had formerly called the Atlantic their home were now at the bottom of the ocean. Even those that remained afloat had to proceed with extreme caution, particularly when in coastal waters, because the sea was still infested with mines. Are you still with me? Are you still with us? I'm doing this right in front of my window, and it's just gotten very, very cloudy and overcast out there. Myra wasn't surprised then when she was told that it would be many months, perhaps even a couple of years, before a boat could be found to take her to Canada. Characteristically, the young nurse decided that she would do her best to make good use of the time. The association was quite satisfied with Myra's nursing qualifications, but Myra knew that with all of her experience and the resourcefulness she had gained from the war years, there was still much she could learn about bringing babies into the world. She soon decided, therefore, to take another course in midwifery and enrolled in the famous Clapham School of Midwifery, which was then directed by Dr. Annie McCall. She elected 2 special courses, one in operative midwifery and another in anesthesia. Myra is eternally grateful for what she learned from Dr. McCall, and is sure that many a Newfoundland woman is alive today because of what she learned at her side. Furthermore, the Kaplan School, was one which made a specialty of training nurses, were likely to have a minimum of equipment and skilled help in isolated places. 45 years and some 3,000 babies later, 3,000 babies, Myra was to make herself unpopular by declaring that today's nurses, for all the expensive training they may have received in the modern techniques, would profit from the same kind of old-fashioned training as she had undergone. She was also outspoken in her contention that there should be more qualified midwives today, particularly in those districts which are far from hospital. This was written in the 70s, and I would say it is especially, and if not more true, now in 2020. Totes my goats. To my way of thinking, she says firmly, there is still no more important work in all the world than that of helping a mother bring new life into the world. At 84, Myra's voice is still young and her eyes still flash with the fire of a crusader. In order to understand what happened to Myra after she had received her diploma from Dr. McCall's unusual school, it would perhaps be well to take time out for a brief refresher course in British history. This requires a drink. Are you ready? Are you ready for a refresher course in British history? The idea of empire was still a very proud one after the war. Britannia still ruled the waves. The sun never set on British soil. London was the mother of parliaments and probably the cultural capital of the world as well. Nor had the zenith been reached yet. Theme song of the day was a thunderously triumphant piece called Land of Hope and Glory, which was something less than usual British restraint, publicly prayed that God, who made thee mighty, make thee mightier yet. The thee, of course, was the British Empire, and in some printings of the song, it was capitalized along with God. It was a time when the far-flung parts of the empire were still colonies, however, and were quietly supposed to be proud of the fact. The Third Statute of Westminster, which was to declare that the dominions were in no ways subordinate to the motherland, but were merely sharing a common allegiance, was still 10 years away. Nor was there any thought that anyone but the British nobleman should be appointed as the king's representative abroad. Which is not to say that Canada had no good governors generals in its colonial days. Some of these men, regardless of their hereditary titles, took a tremendous personal interest in the needs of the young country. And the 4th Earl Grey was certainly one of the more enlightened men. Grey, the son of Queen Victoria's private secretary and grandson of the British Prime Minister of the same name, was far more than an astute and proper Governor-General. From the moment he came to Canada in 1904, he was a devoted student of the Canadian way of life. He was an ardent and well-informed agriculturalist. His keen interest in sport is still remembered every autumn with the representation of the Grey Cup for the Football Championship of Canada. And honest to God, I did not know that until I read that. This is how much I know about sports. Mind blown. He was one of the very first very few people in high places who was far-seeing enough to know that a heavier-than-air flying machine would ultimately prove to be something far more than a dangerous novelty, and in 1910 he made a special trip to Cape Breton to watch a certain young Nova Scotian by the name of J.A.D. McCurdy piloting his flimsy Silver Dart over Bedeque Bay on Brastor Lake. Later, even when the Canadian Minister of Defense gravely declared that an airplane could never be anything but a toy, Earl Grey remained one of the greatest flight enthusiasts of his day. But it was the new Governor General's interest in social improvement which did the most to endear him to Canadian people. And undoubtedly he inherited this trait from his illustrious grandfather, who, some 80 years previous, had given Britain its famous Reform Bill. Grey had a deep and genuine concern for the growing pains of the new country, and he was particularly sympathetic to the tribulations of those who were trying to extend the nation's frontiers. He was in fact so popular in Canada that his term in office was prolonged twice, and he remained in office until October 1911. Unprecedented as such popularity was, it was Grey's lovely wife who was to maintain a Canadian connection longest. Like most other English women of rank, Lady Grey devoted herself completely to war work, and no sooner had the armistice been signed than she began to turn her thoughts and energies towards the Canada she and her husband had come to love so much. Always a very kindly woman, Lady Grey had been particularly concerned with the lack of adequate medical and nursing facilities in the more remote parts of the Dominion. And in an unofficial way, she had taken it upon herself to do something about it. She enlisted the help of other aristocratic English women, raised funds by subscription to supplement her own personal donations, and then sought the advice of the Overseas Nursing Association. Hence, it was that one day the great lady, who had now taken Canada so much to her heart, came across the application of Myra Grimsley, born in 1890, one of a family of 9 children. An accomplished seamstress who could play the piano, attractive, apparently blessed with boundless energy and a commanding personality. In short, a nurse and midwife with splendid qualifications, who was now asking for the privilege to be sent somewhere in the Canadian wilderness. Lady Grey asked that Myra be sent to her in person. She was a very gracious lady, Myra says now. She was the kind of woman you instinctively knew to be genuine. I liked her. Lady Grey must have liked Myra too, because she ended the interview by asking her if she would like to go out to Canada to get to a place of her Grace's choosing. I will try to get you a posting in Saskatchewan, she said, but it might be Manitoba. Myra was jubilant, and it was now that she set about preparing herself for the adventure by enrolling in Dr. McCall's school. As has already been noted, this was a 3-month course, and Myra was of the opinion that by the time she had her diploma, there would be a way for her to get across the Atlantic. In this, she would be badly mistaken, for the sea lanes were still risky 2 years after the war had ended, and shipping space was so unattainable as ever. The months of waiting and waiting gathered into years, and Myra didn't take kindly to waiting. She still doesn't. Finally, another titled lady of the Empire asked to see her one day. Her name was Lady Harris, wife of Sir Alexander Harris, the governor of Newfoundland. I've heard about you from a good friend of mine, Lady Harris explained when Myra was ushered into her London office. The good friend proved to be Lady Grey, and the reasons for the warmth of that friendship were not difficult to understand. Lady Harris herself, the mother of 3, was overwhelmed with the pitiful, inadequate medical facilities which she and her husband had discovered when they went to Newfoundland, and the proposition she wanted to make to Myra now took little explanation. There are still no berths available for you young nurses going out to Canada, but we have a ship leaving for St. John's in April. The need for nurses in Newfoundland is even greater than the need in Saskatchewan. Would you go? It did not take Myra long to decide. To this day, Myra treasures a 5-cent school scribbler called the Royal Exercise Book, in which she set down some of the more memorable events surrounding the momentous trip across the Atlantic. It is obviously a book which has now sailed Newfoundland waters as far as well because it smells faintly of fish, and the photos of their imperial majesties on the cover are flecked with bilge water. The record of Myra's leave-taking, however, is still almost as fresh as the day it was written. And so now we have a couple of things from her journal. We left on April 13th, 1921. Friday the 13th, the diary begins. It was a gray day over Liverpool, and nobody seemed to be happy. The transport workers were threatening a strike, and this had moved the shipping firm to schedule their departure date 1 day earlier in order to avoid a work stoppage. The men who were stowing the freight were being rushed a bit to get the ship ready for sailing, and they did not like it. One, a doleful Irishman, was even predicting disaster for them. It's tempting providence, it is, he kept saying. Sail this ship on Friday the 13th with all them blinking mines still loose in the sea. It's only asking for trouble, that's all. But if the other passengers listened to him, Myra didn't. She writes, to a Cockney who had never before set foot on a large liner, these mutterings could only be treated with disdain. Nothing could possibly happen to me to spoil the huge adventure upon which I was embarking. For 2 years I had lived for this day, and whatever lay ahead of me, it was what I wanted to do. It was my idea of complete attainment. For the others aboard the vessel, there were tears when the tug finally began to move them out the Mersey and out to sea. Not for Myra. Not for Myra, though. Strangely enough, she records that as the outline of England faded in the distance, she began to think rather bitterly of the matron who had done her best to make life miserable when Myra had been district nurse during the war. Never again, she writes, would a matron be able to reduce me to such a feeling of hopelessness. There would be people whom I could help now without being afraid to say that I had helped for fear of an avalanche of sarcastic comment. Henceforth, I was not to be ruled by one individual. The sea voyage was no holiday. Another nurse who was also going out to Newfoundland at Lady Harris's invitation was Myra's traveling companion, and the ship had no sooner reached open sea when she became violently seasick. So did the wife of a returned Newfoundland soldier, with whom Myra had struck up an acquaintance. This poor woman was Scottish, had a daughter of 2, and a new baby just a few weeks old. Unfortunately, she had developed a septic condition from her last labor, and this, combined with seasickness, made it impossible for her to look after her children. Myra was instantly nurse, nursemaid, and laundrywoman. Did I get seasick? She asks. No, indeed, I was too busy. The trip took 10 days, and on the last day of April, the ship entered the rock-pillared harbor of St. John's. Of that event, Myra writes, what a beautiful sight. It was early morning and very cold, and frosty rime was over everything. The day was fine and clear, with a pink pearly hue glistening over the myriads of frosty facets. The air was so sweet and clean that it tasted good. A Newfoundland man who stood beside me said, well, what do you think of it? I replied, oh, it's just marvelous. Huh, he said, you'll do. And I didn't quite know what he meant by that. And that's the end of our intro and chapter 2 of Don't Have Your Baby in the Dory. stay tuned for chapter 3, which is called Newfoundland 1921 and the New Adventure Begins. I hope you enjoyed this little adult story time and that it just gave you a little moment of reprieve. And I hope that everything is well where you are and that you're staying well and staying healthy and staying safe. I'll talk to you soon, everybody. Keep being magic. Bye.